Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to see you here. It's fantastic to see such a large crowd. It's lovely to see friends old and new on this annual celebration of Through the Dice annual lecture. Just to tell you the order of events today, there's a DICE overview. I am Bob Smith. I'll be giving that DICE overview. I'm the director of DICE. Then we'll have the DICE lecture given by Professor Dave Goulson. There'll be some time for questions and answers. Then we'll have the prize awards where we give prizes to our students and staff. We'll finish the event with a vote of thanks from Professor Shane Weller, who's kindly joining us today, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research and Innovation. And then afterwards, there's going to be a book signing just outside there. So Dave will, the nice people from Blackwell's have sorted this out with some books. So there'll be a book signing too. So for people who don't know, DICE, the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology, was founded in 1989. We're part of the School of Anthropology and Conservation, but also have members from other schools within the university. And in 2019, we were awarded a Queen's Anniversary Prize in recognition of the value of our research, training and impact. There's about 284 members. I say about, there are 284 members in terms of students and staff, with an alumni network that's now over 1,500 people from 107 countries. So here are all the staff members, and this year we've been able to welcome Dominic Munzel and Mohammed Fahadinia to join us. And we also have an advisory board. So the DICE advisory board that actually just met before coming here today. So this is a set of people from government, NGOs, business, who all have a huge amount of expertise in conservation, and they sort of guide us on what we're doing. This year we've been joined by Dr. Humphrey Crick from Natural England, and the return of Dr. Glyn Davies from WWF and now Wider Things. And so it's brilliant that they're joining, but the reason for flagging this up is that Matthew Hatchwell has been the chair of the DICE advisory board now for about 5 years and has done a fantastic job. So he's standing down and Glyn's taking over. Matthew's having a well-deserved rest, but I just wanted to thank him for everything that he's done for DICE over the last few years. It's been incredibly helpful, and all your support has been brilliant. So thank you very much. So just an overview of the sort of highlights of our research. Again, with the Deputy Vice-Chancellor here, I should flag up the things that we've had published in Nature and Nature Family journals. So there are 3 of our highest impact articles there. And also actually a really nice piece in Nature about careers in conservation, all about Jim Groombridge's career from when he was a very young man. If you look at that article, you can see what it was like before he joined the University of Kent, when he got to fly around in helicopters and save endangered bird species. And also the work of our students and staff has been highlighted in the media across a whole set of newspapers and websites, and I think is a nice reflection of the sort of breadth of the work that we do, whether it's parrots in London, the genetics of camels, well-being and nature, and the fact that the smell of nature makes people feel better about themselves, house building, which makes most of us in this room feel worse about ourselves, and also elephants. In terms of our students, 3 of them have been, their great work's been recognised in different ways. So Ardi's was asked to join this Science Leadership Collaborative cohort, a group of Indonesian sort of leaders, so from across the board. So the fact that he was selected to represent conservation in that group is fantastic. Steve Elaine was given the National Biodiversity Network Award for wildlife recording, and Dominique Gonçalves won the 2022 Leif Erikson Young Explorer Award. So again, congratulations to them. And following on from Dominique, because Dominique, together with Rosa Dean and Michaela Lowe, asked me to remind everyone in the room of this amazing initiative that they've been, their group has been running for several years now, the Women in Conservation Canterbury Network. So they're meeting Friday, 17th of March, and anyone who's at the university who's interested in going along, they'd be most welcome. So yeah, this is a really important initiative, student-led initiative that again is, they should be really congratulated for. Outreach and engagement, please follow us on all of these channels. So it's been, again, an active time on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and Instagram. We've continued to have the DICE Instagram takeover. So every 2 weeks, either one of our students, staff or alumni does 3 posts on Instagram to talk about what they're doing, what they learned while they were at DICE, and sort of general advice about conservation. And so there's a whole set of lovely photos and really nice advice up there now. We also had the second BioBlitz. So this was last June. And one of the reasons for mentioning it now is that there will be another one this year, sometime in May. So please, keep your eyes peeled for that. So this is, for people who don't know, a BioBlitz is within a 24-hour period in a certain place, you try and record as many species as possible. So, we're obviously blessed here of having this fantastic campus. So it's a really nice event where the public are welcome to. So it's a great way of showing people what we've got on campus and getting them involved. Here's some photos of the event. We had, can you imagine, this is what Canterbury looked like once. So, it was a beautiful sunny day last summer. And so we'll definitely be repeating that again this year. So please keep an eye out. And similarly, we had a really successful DICE Twitter conference. So this was another student-led initiative like the BioBlitz. During COVID, people said, given that we can't leave our rooms, could we have a Twitter conference? So we organized that. So this will be again happening in July, where students and staff and alumni all do 6 tweets on a particular topic about the conservation work that they're doing. So again, please keep an eye out for that. And a really nice recent thing, through the generosity of the university, we've got a bit of funding to purchase some camera traps. You can see the camera trap on a tree there. That's not one of ours. But yes, we're going to set up a new project working with Kent Wildlife Trust and the other NGOs that are part of the Wild Blean initiative to do camera trapping across the Blean, initially north of the campus. We hope to expand it, because we've always felt we do world-leading research on camera trap data, how to collect it, how to analyze it, but most of that work is in Indonesia and Mongolia and Brazil. So we thought it would be really nice to bring that level of expertise closer to home. So there's going to be opportunities for students to get involved in this over the coming years, and we hope it will become a really nice long-term monitoring project. And the other big news, arguably the biggest news, is that recently the university has come up with a policy of recognizing specific institutes within the university as sort of centers of excellence for that get further support. And we're delighted that DICE has become one of those 3 institutes. So we'll have more support for the education and student experience, research and innovation, and civic engagement. So this is one of the reasons why we're celebrating this evening, that we've got this new status. And as part of that, we have funding to resume the DICE talks. Some of you may remember the DICE talks that were a monthly set of events, and then COVID happened and they sort of didn't really start again. So they will be coming back. So we'll be doing monthly talks, some online, some in person. And please sign up to the mailing list. I know that some of you are in the room today because you got the email about the talk. So yeah, this will be the best way of finding out the events that are coming up. And we very provisionally, so this is why you should join the mailing list, because the details might change. But Nick Deere has very kindly agreed to talk about some of this amazing camera trap research with a, I'm sure, a set of really nice photos, but also showing how that work then is used to inform conservation policy and practice. So yes, that'll be the first ICE lecture for a long time, starting in April, and then there'll be monthly after that. So moving on to the main event. It's absolutely fantastic that we've got Professor Dave Goulson here today. So Dave is a professor of biology at the University of Sussex, specialising in bee ecology. He's published more than 300 scientific articles in the ecology and conservation of bumblebees and other insects, and been awarded a number of prestigious academic prizes. But the reason why we invited him to give this year's DICE lecture, and the reason why many of you are here tonight, is because of all of his work that builds on that academic excellence, but takes it a step further. So this work stems from his fascination with insects, which started in childhood, and it also comes from his recognition that academic work on its own rarely achieves change. So to achieve that change, he's done things like founding the Bumblebee Conservation Trust in 2006, which now has about 12,000 members. And he's also a trustee of Pesticide Action Network and an ambassador for the UK Wildlife Trust. But the other thing that he does is write these amazing popular science books that inspire a whole set of people to make change. So that includes the Sunday Times bestseller A Sting in the Tail in 2013, and his most recent work, Silent Earth. So it's this latest book that will form the basis of his talk today. And please join me in welcoming Dave to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks for that lovely introduction. So today I'm going to talk to you about insects, about why they're important, and I'll touch on the evidence for their declines, and then mostly spend my time talking about what we can do to ensure there are plentiful insects into the future. I've always been a bit of an insect nut, one of those strange geeky kids that loved bugs. And when I was at primary school, I remember collecting caterpillars in my lunchbox and taking them home, and they all died because I fed them the wrong stuff. But I tried again, and eventually I got them to turn into moths, and I thought that was amazing, and I've been kind of hooked ever since, I guess. And I've been lucky to make a career out of that childhood hobby. There we go. So I don't think actually I was that weird. I think lots of kids love bugs given half a chance. This is my youngest son, Seth, with his pet cockchafer, Colin. Sadly, Colin's no longer with us, but Seth is very much in his bug phase still, and I really hope he doesn't grow out of it. But the sad reality is that most people do, that most teenagers and adults, they don't like insects. They're frightened of insects. Their reaction if something buzzes near them is to try and kill it. And this for me is exemplified by, so I saw this picture on Twitter last summer. It's from the University of South Wales. Obviously, you won't be able to read the top bit, unless you speak Welsh, but warning, flying insects in the area. Oh my God, flying insects, heaven forbid. What kind of message does that send out to people? It's obviously you're sending the message that flying insects are something to be terrified of. And all it was some flying ants, for Christ's sake. I'm sorry, I despair sometimes of the stupidity of these actions. Anyway, insects are actually amazing creatures that we should cherish, as I shall hopefully explain. They're incredibly diverse. They've been on, the first insects are about 480 million years old, so they're really ancient. It's among the first creatures on Earth. And so they've had plenty of time to speciate and diversify and turn into all these amazing different shapes and forms. There are about 1.1 million known species of insect, which is about 70% of all life that we know of on the planet. And what's really kind of mind-boggling is that it's estimated that there may be 3, 4, 5, 6 million more that we haven't discovered. So the majority of life on our planet we haven't yet found out about, which I think is kind of really exciting, isn't it? Who knows what amazing beasts are out there. But sadly, as you probably have heard somewhere along the line, these amazing creatures are in decline. They've been around a very long time. They've been very successful. They've survived all the previous mass extinction events that have occurred. But most scientists agree now we're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction event, and it's affecting all organisms on the planet. But its effect on insects wasn't really, I don't think, appreciated until about 2017, when this paper was published based on German data. I was a very minor author, and I was sent this data. It's based on malaise trapping. So that top right is a malaise trap. It catches flying insects of more or less any type, and most insects fly. And they fall into a bottle of alcohol, and what a bunch of German insect enthusiasts over a long period from the late 1980s put malaise traps on nature reserves all over Germany. And what the chart shows you is the biomass of insects caught per trap per day, and how it changed between 1989 and 2016, which is about 27 years. And you can see it fell. It actually fell by 76% on average, which is pretty terrifying. I remember seeing these data and thinking, well, there must be something wrong here. They must have made some really silly mistake or something. But whatever way you look at them, and we spent a long time, it seemed pretty clear that this was real. And in fact, since there's been lots of corroborative evidence suggesting that Germany isn't a special case, that actually insect abundance has dropped a lot. But the only thing that most people have noticed is that if you're of a certain age, you can remember when your car windscreen got covered in bug splats in the summer, and that just doesn't seem to happen anymore. I'll show you one other example closer to home. There are enormous knowledge gaps. So most insects aren't being monitored by anybody, but the ones that are seem to be declining. We don't have kind of population estimates for most insects at all, including bumblebees, which are my speciality. But we do have maps, and they tell the same kind of story. So this is the shrill-carder bumblebee. It's called the shrill-carder because it has a slightly higher pitched buzz than most bumblebees, which means you can actually, with practice, you can hear there's one, detect what it is just from the sound with a bit of experience. Anyway, it used to be a common insect in Britain pre-1960. But as time has gone on, it's become less common. Now, I got interested in bumblebee conservation about the millennium, by which point this bee was down to about 6 kind of population cores. And I set out to find it. I was at the University of Southampton on the south coast, and I thought I couldn't find much about the ecology of this bee. And I thought, well, we need to understand more if we're going to conserve this species. So I spent a summer on Salisbury Plain, which is there, searching for this bee. I only actually found a handful of them, so it wasn't terribly productive in terms of finding out about their ecology. But I remember getting really excited when I finally found one of these high-pitched buzzing bees. But sadly, that population's now extinct. And the one on the Somerset Levels just to the west seems to be about to go extinct. So this bee is disappearing. Within my lifetime, it's gone from being a common insect to teetering on the edge of going extinct. And it isn't alone, sadly. So why does it matter that insects are disappearing? I'm guessing most of you probably don't need convincing that insects are important, but I'm going to rehearse the arguments anyway. So insects make up the bulk of life on Earth, as I've already explained. And then they're food for a very large proportion of the things that aren't insects. So most species of bird eat insects, either all the time or to feed their chicks, as do bats, lots of species of freshwater fish, amphibians, reptiles. They all depend on insects. So if the prey is disappearing, then obviously they're going to disappear. But insects aren't just important as food. They do lots of other stuff. They're kind of like they make the world go round. They're involved in more or less every ecological process you can think of. Things like controlling pests in farming, recycling dung and dead leaves and trees and dead bodies and all sorts of other materials. They help to keep the soil healthy. They distribute seeds. They're busy doing all sorts of really important stuff, most of which we completely take for granted. Nobody ever really stops to thank the dung beetle for clearing away cowpats, but it's a good job that they do it. The one thing that is appreciated by many people these days is this, of course, pollination. It's the one ecosystem service that's relatively easy to measure and widely recognized. I should stress that it's often thought that it's done entirely by bees, and that's wildly inaccurate. Pollination is actually delivered by thousands of species of insect and elsewhere in the world by a few other creatures, birds and bats and so on. But in Europe, exclusively by insects, more or less. Pollinators include bees and butterflies and moths, and lots of species of flies, wasps, beetles, and so on, all of them getting in on the act. There's at least 6,000 pollinating species just in the UK. And between them, insect pollinators pollinate about 80% of all the plant species on our planet. So most plant species would ultimately disappear if they weren't being pollinated. And of course, there's a direct relevance to us here, that 75% or thereabouts of all the crop species that we grow in the world need insect pollination to give a good yield. And that includes everything from sort of apples, strawberries, raspberries, cherries, tomatoes, chili peppers, squashes, even things like coffee and chocolate depend upon insect pollinators. So we've become used to supermarkets being replete with this amazing array of fruits and veg 12 months of the year. But it wouldn't look so good if we took away the pollinating insects. And the reality is that it would be really hard to feed the growing human population without insect pollinators. And so we need to avoid ending up like these folk. You may have seen these pictures before. They're taken in southwest China. There's an area where there are huge apple and pear orchards, which they now pollinate by hand. They've been doing this for the best part of 30 years because the pollinator population fell so low that they weren't getting a good harvest, and they took to hand pollinating each flower and sending their children climbing up to the higher branches. China, obviously, labor is relatively cheap, and this is a high value crop. But it's hard to imagine this being economic in many other crops. Imagine a European farmer hand pollinating his oilseed rape field. It's not really going to happen, I don't think. So we really ought to look after our bees. So there are selfish reasons why we humans ought to look after insects, because we depend on them for all the things that they do in ecosystems that help to deliver us food. And I've trotted this argument out hundreds of times over the years. And it's all true, and you can put figures to it. You can say that, pollination services are worth $257 billion a year, or I think that's right, and so on. But actually, it worries me slightly, this kind of utilitarian argument for conserving creatures, because, well, there's two basic problems with it. The first is that actually, I don't think it's very inspiring. It's not why I care about insects. I care about them because I don't know, really. I just think they're really interesting. They're beautiful. They're amazing. Surely they deserve to live. And the other problem is there's probably loads of insects that don't do anything particularly useful that we could live without. And just to give you an example, there you go. Isn't that a magnificent beast? That is the St. Helena giant earwig. It's the biggest earwig that ever lived, about 3 inches long, a real whopper. But sadly, it's extinct. It only ever lived on St. Helena, which is this tiny island in the South Atlantic. It lived in seabird colonies, but sadly, we accidentally introduced rats, and we think they ate all the giant earwigs. Hasn't been seen for about 50 years now. It wasn't doing anything vital, so far as we know. There was no kind of ecological catastrophe when it went extinct. But nonetheless, surely the world is a sadder place for not having a giant earwig, even if none of us were ever going to see this creature. As I say, I think, the rest of life on our planet deserves a space, it deserves to live, whether it's useful to us or not, I would argue. So if we're going to look after insects, we need to change what we're doing in a number of ways. And so for the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on things we can do. And I'm going to sort of divide it up into three rough areas. I'm going to talk a bit about farming, then I'll talk a bit about rewilding, and then I'll talk about, I've called it urban rewilding, gardening, essentially. The farming bit is really short, and really it deserves a talk or several talks. It's big and it's complicated, and actually it's the biggest issue. In the UK, about 70% of the land is farmed these days. Globally, the spread of intensive farming is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss and a cause of many other environmental problems. And unless we get that right, I think we're really going to struggle to conserve insects or anything much else. And I think one of the biggest questions facing mankind right now is, how do we feed everybody without destroying the planet, without undermining the basis of our own existence? We've gone down a route of intensive and ever more intensive farming with more and more chemical inputs, more fertilizers, more pesticides, bigger fields, more machinery, GM crops coming soon to a place near you, and so on. I think that it's not sustainable, that this is a bit of a dead end, and that if we're not careful, we'll all end up starving precisely because we've done too much intensive farming. So there's at least three major things wrong with what we're currently doing, as sort of exemplified by each of the three pictures up there. So starting bottom right, these huge monocultures of crops are displacing biodiversity, and yet they depend upon it. Farming needs pollinators, it needs biocontrol agents to control pests. It needs organisms to keep the soil healthy and so on. So it's undermining its own foundations. And very similarly, it's also causing a lot of damage to soil. There was a recent United Nations report which estimated that about 40% of the world's soils are now badly degraded, with intensive farming the main culprit for that. Well, what are future generations going to grow their food in if we've damaged the soil? It takes thousands of years to replace. And then finally, food production and processing and so on contributes something like 25 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, which we all know we need to rein in. But there was a recent study just a couple of days ago, which I haven't actually read beyond the Guardian headlines, but suggesting that just methane production from livestock will take us past 1.5 degrees if we don't reduce it very quickly. So I don't think we should be carrying on. We need to change direction, basically. We need to use our brains and come up with a truly sustainable way of feeding ourselves without destroying the planet. So what might sustainable farming look like? I think it's useful to just step back for a second and think, so what are the basics? What do we want from farming? We obviously need farming. It's all very well for me to bash farmers over the head and say you're wiping out wildlife, but we all depend on what they do on farmers to produce food. We obviously need farming to look after the soil so that future generations inherit soil. I think we should be growing a much greater diversity of crops. There's lots of evidence to suggest that that's more sustainable and also good for us, because at the moment, globally, we grow a very small range of crops. And that's one of the reasons why our diets are so poor and we have an epidemic of obesity and diabetes worldwide. I kind of think, and this sounds a bit sort of hippy-dippy, but really, I think we need to essentially work with natural processes. We need to work by encouraging pollinators and natural enemies of crop pests, rather than trying to use chemical solutions all the time, which ultimately fail when pests become resistant. So I think we need to either massively reduce pesticide use or ideally do without them entirely. And the exciting thing is, and I haven't got time to talk about this tonight at all, but there are actually loads of really cool things going on in the farming sector. I'm sure some of you already know about them, all broadly under the sort of regenerative farming banner. I went to the Oxford Real Farming Conference, which takes place every January, which is kind of the alternative farming conference. But it was absolutely rammed with thousands of delegates there, all of them interested in new ways of farming sustainably, essentially. There's in the UK, there's the Nature Friendly Farming Network, which now has something like 9,000 members, all of them farmers who want to work out how to support wildlife on their farm while still being economic and producing food. There's things like agroforestry, which I think offers real promise, which I haven't got time to tell you about, but basically involves growing strips of trees or other perennial crops to divide up your fields, hold the soil together, and so on. And even things like, which probably would be dismissed by most people as slightly kind of left field, biodynamic farming. I was really skeptical about biodynamic farming because as a scientist, it's hard to kind of reconcile some of their practices, which includes essentially a bit of witchcraft. They make potions and sprinkle them on their crops. But actually, if you go to a biodynamic farm, and I've visited a few now, they all produce pretty good yields from their land without using any pesticides or synthetic fertilizers. The soil is really healthy. That's a big focus of what they're doing. And the places are teeming with wildlife. So they show, if nothing else, that it's perfectly possible to produce good yields of crops and support nature at the same time. They don't have to be kind of at loggerheads with one another. Anyway, that's all I have time to say about farming. I'm now going to skip on to my second how to save the insect topic, which is rewilding, which is dead trendy, but not everyone's cup of tea. It's strange. It's become a really controversial kind of Marmite word. There are people that start frothing at the mouth if you say rewilding to them. I don't really understand why. I'm quite a big fan. Of course, we're not going to compulsorily rewild anywhere. We're not going to take a farmer's land away and release bears. And we can't rewild everywhere. We need to produce lots of food. But I think there's scope for some rewilding, more than we're doing at present. So what is rewilding, for those of you, if there is anyone here that doesn't have a good idea already? I first came across it in the context of Yellowstone, which I'm sure is an example many of you have heard of. So Yellowstone National Park is a huge national park in the United States, which until quite recently was in a really poor ecological state because it was absolutely overrun with what they call elk, which are essentially red deer. It was terribly overgrazed. The soil was all blowing away. The trees couldn't regenerate because they were all being eaten as soon as they germinated. It was a mess. And the decision was taken to release wolves, reintroduce wolves, which were a kind of missing part of the ecosystem. They'd been there naturally, but had been hunted out decades earlier. And not everyone agrees with the story as to how what effect the wolves had, but the usual interpretation is that the wolves had a really profound positive effect on Yellowstone, not particularly by reducing the population of deer, because there are only a couple of dozen wolves. It's not a huge number, and they're not physically able to massively reduce the deer population, but they changed the behavior of the deer so that they tend to stay in the open and herd together, and they avoid steep-sided river valleys in particular because they can get trapped there by the wolves. And because of that, trees started to regenerate along the rivers, which meant there was more food for beavers. So the beaver population rose and produced more dams, which provided more habitat for bird life. And so there was this whole cascade. If you want the full version, George Monbiot's got a video. You may or may not like George Monbiot, but it's worth watching. As I say, not everyone agrees with that it was all to do with the wolves, but one way or another, it seems to have been a success. In a European context, it's a bit different. Rewilding is mostly focused on reintroducing big herbivores, and there's good reason for that. So when I was at university, I remember being taught that that Europe was naturally a dense forest, and then people came along and started clearing land for agriculture. And that makes sense, because if you leave a plot of land unmanaged, it will usually turn into a woodland within a few decades. But it poses an interesting question. If that were true, where did all the creatures live that don't live in woodland? The creatures found in the flowers that live in sunlight, in meadows, and all the butterflies and other insects associated with sunny open habitats. Where did they live? More recently, many ecologists at least have come around to accepting that probably it wasn't all dense forest, that maybe it was more patchy, a mosaic of habitats maintained by the action of large herbivores, things like the auroch, the giant cow, now extinct, but that used to roam the forests of Europe. Only 100 or so thousand years ago, there were elephants wandering around Europe. There were ponies, there were lots of deer and wild pigs and so on. So the idea of most rewilding projects in Europe is to restore these missing big herbivores in the hope that that will maintain a diversity of habitats and restore biodiversity in a natural way. Now, I know there's some really interesting rewilding projects, including bison released in Kent, but I've not visited those sites. The one I'm familiar with is the Knepp project in West Sussex, which is not so far away. And I would really suggest that if you have time this spring or summer, it's worth a visit. So let me just tell you a little bit about it. The Knepp project is based on an estate. It's just a bit west of Gatwick Airport, really. It's 3,500 acres on this heavy clay soil, which until 20 years ago was intensively farmed. It was inherited by a guy who went to agricultural college. He was taught how to farm very conventionally, and he tried to make a go of farming his estate when he took it over. But he found he was losing money because the yields aren't great. And so he farmed it ever more intensively, put more and more inputs in, and still couldn't make a living, just heavy subsidies, farm subsidies. And one day decided to do things differently, that he couldn't carry on as he was. And instead went down the rewilding route. And essentially, they put a big fence around the outside, took out all the internal fences, threw in as many large herbivores as they could lay their hands on. So they couldn't get any aurochs because they're extinct. So they put in some longhorn cattle and some ponies and some Tamworth pigs because they sadly weren't allowed to introduce wild boar, even though they're a native species, which seems a bit nuts to me. Some red deer, recently beaver, and stork, white stork, which is really cool. They're nesting all over Knepp now if you get a chance to visit. And essentially the principle of rewilding, which I think is really interesting, is instead of like a conventional nature reserve where you're managing it for specific purposes, you're trying to maintain that orchid population or that rare butterfly or whatever. You don't have a goal. You just see what nature does. You step back. And it seems like nature's done a pretty good job at Knepp of thriving without too much interference. If you go for a walk there in the spring, you'll hear turtle doves, which is one of the only places in lowland England you'll hear turtle doves. They're nearly extinct. You'll hear cuckoos singing, which is also now very rare in lowland England. And you'll very likely hear nightingales singing. They have the second biggest nightingale population in the whole of the UK, from having no nightingales 20 years ago. And on the insect front, they've got the biggest population of purple emperor butterflies in the whole of the UK, and they didn't have any at all 20 years ago. This last summer, they found large tortoiseshells, top right there, which were supposed to be extinct in Britain. I'm slightly suspicious as to how they suddenly arrived at Knepp, but anyway, nice to see them wherever they came from. Basically, the place is buzzing with life and birdsong, and it seems to me that we could do a bit more of this. We can't do it everywhere, but it certainly supports a lot of biodiversity. It's also probably capturing carbon in the soil and the trees. And it's really good for recreation and tourism and for reconnecting people with nature, because tens of thousands of people a day go to Knepp and wander around to look at the stalks and hope to see a beaver and a butterfly and all the rest of it. I'd love it if we had a scattering of these projects dotted all over the UK on the least productive land that isn't producing much food. Okay. So that's rewilding. Finally, gardening, something we can all get involved in. Sadly, most of us don't have a farm or a 3,500 acre estate in Sussex. Be nice, wouldn't it? But anyway, but many people do have a garden, a space they can call their own, where they can do what they like. There are about 22 million private gardens in the UK, and they cover collectively, it's an area of about 400,000 hectares, which is a lot of land. And just imagine if they were all managed for nature, they were all pesticide free and full of wildflowers and bumblebees and butterflies and so on. That would really make a difference. And if we could get the councils on board, so that the parks and the cemeteries and the road verges and the roundabouts were all being managed for wildlife too, then that would be a national network of wildlife friendly habitat. It's probably not enough on its own, but it would be a really nice step in the right direction. And there's no real downside to this. It's not like farming, where you've got to trade off food production against looking after the environment. If making our gardens wilder doesn't really have a downside, apart from we have to get used to things looking slightly different, nicer in my view, but not necessarily everyone else's. Anyway, I think there's huge potential here, both for supporting nature and for reconnecting people with nature by inviting it in to our cities, so we don't see crazy signs like the one in the University of South Wales. So I've written, sorry, I've plugged my own books. I've written books about what you might do. I've also made lots of YouTube videos about how to make your garden more wildlife friendly, should you be interested. This is how not to make your garden more wildlife friendly. So while there's this really exciting movement towards more sort of gentle gardening, wildlife friendly gardening, whatever you want to call it, urban rewilding, there's also a counter movement. There's a growth in use of plastic grass. 8% of UK gardens, according to a recent survey, have plastic lawns. How depressing is that? You can even get plastic hedges now. I took that picture. Unbelievable. Why would anyone want? Oh, it's just too awful for words. But so I wish we could reach a point where, I mean, I personally would just ban these things, but the alternative is to make them socially unacceptable, so that people are ashamed to have a plastic lawn. That's my hope, anyway. But so I'm guessing most of you don't have a plastic lawn. I hope not. But if you're a gardener, there are lots of other ways you can do things which are not so good for the environment, that are less obvious. So many people's idea of how to garden is to jump in a car at the weekend and drive to a big garden centre and get a trolley and fill it up with a load of annual bedding plants grown in disposable plastic pots in a peat-based compost, probably treated with fertilizers and pesticides, and then get some Roundup herbicide to spray the garden paths, and some bug clear to spray the aphids on the roses, and a great sack of peat-based compost to pot your plants up into. And you can see where I'm going. There's none of this is really great. Gardening as an industry has lots of negative impacts. But on the other hand, gardens can be real oases for wildlife. And there's a really interesting example, this amazing example from Leicester. There was a lady called Jenny Owen. I say was, she may still be alive, bless her. She'd be 88 if she is. But she's lived in urban Leicester, quite near the city centre, had an 1/8 of an acre garden. And she spent 35 years obsessively cataloguing every species she could find, birds, insects, plants, and so on. And her species list after 35 years was 2,673 in an 1/8 of an acre. That's mind-boggling. It's amazing. You know, I would have guessed that would be the sort of species richness in a bit of rainforest or something, not in the middle of Leicester. But it just goes to show that we can all have thousands of species living with us if we just do some really simple things. So what are they? Well, I haven't got time. I've only got a few minutes left. But I'll skim through a few pointers as to what you might do to make your garden more wildlife friendly. Firstly, there's pretty good evidence that native plants tend to be better than non-natives. There's one study I was involved in, which looked at pollinator visits to a whole range of different plants. And on average, native plants attracted more pollinators than non-natives. Not by much, though, to be fair. There are some wonderful non-natives that attract swarms of bees and butterflies and so on. But on average, natives are better. And there's 3 examples of really pretty native plants that are dead easy to grow in a garden. And I'd encourage you, if you've got any kind of outdoor space, to try and grow those as well as many other native plants. So that's marjoram and Viper's bugloss and greater knapweed on the right there. But there are loads of others to choose from. But so although there's evidence that they attract more pollinators, there isn't a big difference, not really. But the real benefit of planting native species, I think, is for herbivorous insects, ones that eat the tissues, the leaves and stem of the plants and so on, which tend to be much fussier. Pollinators don't really care where a flower is from as long as the nectar is sweet. Whereas things like the caterpillars of butterflies, as I discovered when I was 6 or 7 years old, when I collected those caterpillars up, if you don't feed them the right thing, they just die rather than eating the wrong thing. They're really fussy. So, for example, the orange-tip butterfly is a familiar British butterfly. If you grow its food plant, and there's only 2 or 3 food plants, things like lady's smock, then there's a really good chance they'll come into your garden and lay their eggs, and you'll have your own little breeding population of this beautiful native butterfly. If you don't grow the food plant, there is 0 chance it will come and breed in your garden. And to give you a more sort of a bigger example, if you have the space for a new tree in your garden, you plant an oak tree or a native tree, you can support it when it's mature. It will support hundreds of species of native wildlife. If you plant a gum tree and a eucalyptus, as many people do in your garden, unless you've got a pet koala, it will feed absolutely nothing. It's just dead space. So wherever we can, we should be squeezing in native plants, including being more tolerant of weeds. Now, I know this is, some people find this a struggle, but there are certain native plants which have been taught are kind of bad. You know, if you're a rubbish gardener if you've got dandelions in your lawn, or thistles or ragwort or whatever. But these are native wildflowers. All 3 of these species are really attractive to pollinators. Things like dandelions in the spring are a really important nectar resource for hungry bumblebee queens coming out of hibernation when there aren't many other flowers about. So we should try to be tolerant of these plants whenever they occur. It sounds a bit silly perhaps, but you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just like that by calling them wildflowers, because that's basically what they are. I came across this really nice example from East London of a project to highlight the diversity of weeds. It was run by a lady called Sophie LeGill, and she was More Than Weeds, she called it. She basically set about identifying all the weeds growing in the cracks in the pavement in her northeast London borough. And then to highlight how many, she found 40 odd species literally growing in the cracks in the pavement. And then she chalked the names, went around chalking the names next to the plants so that to attract the attention of passers-by, so that they actually paid attention to these things, which they've been presumably treading on for years and had never thought about at all. And there's all these interesting plants right under our feet, even in the middle of London, which I think is kind of sweet. Sadly, this kind of thing is still very common in many of our urban areas, the exact opposite of what Sophie was trying to achieve. So this, I'm sure you can see, is the result of someone enthusiastically herbiciding a little bit of vegetation that was trying to grow around a tree. That was actually down in Dorset, but you see similar things all over Britain. There are many councils, they literally employ teams of people to drive around the streets looking for anything green, and if they see it, they'll jump out and spray it and kill it. It just seems completely mad, just mindless environmental kind of vandalism. What harm was that little bit? It was probably just grass, but it was a bit of life. It might have had a few insects living in there. Surely it doesn't look better like that. And not only is this unnecessary kind of from an environmental perspective, but it's also potentially dangerous. It's really controversial, but the chemical that's always used is Roundup, which is based on glyphosate. Now, the World Health Organization says glyphosate is a probable carcinogen. There was actually a study just a few days ago that came out suggesting that it also exposure of children to glyphosate causes liver inflammation and metabolic disorders. It's disputed by the manufacturers, of course, But why are we spraying something that's a probable carcinogen all over our streets? It's also the most widely used pesticide in our gardens. You can buy it from Waitrose. Actually, no, Waitrose have just recently banned it, but lots of garden centres, some supermarkets, completely untrained people can go and buy all sorts of poisons to spray around willy-nilly in their backyard or front yard or wherever. I personally think we should just ban these things. I think it's completely bonkers that we allow them to be sold to just anybody. I don't suppose many people bother reading the back of the bottle, the instructions. They don't bother wearing rubber gloves when spraying them or anything else. It seems kind of nuts. And France have already done this successfully. They banned urban pesticide use by either the council or home gardeners in 2018. And Paris hasn't been overrun by cockroaches or dandelions or whatever. So if Paris can be pesticide free, why can't everywhere, I would say. Maybe you don't spray any pesticides in your garden. Maybe you're an organic gardener like me. But just a couple of other things to watch out for. That there are two ways that many people are less aware of where you might accidentally introduce pesticides to your garden. The first is that the beautiful garden plants on sale in your local garden centre, including those that are badged up as being perfect for pollinators or bee friendly, I've almost certainly been sprayed with a whole bunch of pesticides to keep them looking beautiful. Often before they got to the garden centre won't know because they typically buy in all their plants from wholesalers, many of whom get them from abroad. So there's no kind of supply chain records about what pesticides were used. But we tested the pollen and nectar of plants sold from the main UK garden centre chains as bee friendly. And 98% of them contain at least one pesticide. Most contain several. One particular heather plant, I remember, had 10 different pesticides in it. 75% of them contained neonicotinoid insecticides, which have become notorious because they're neurotoxins. They're really poisonous to insects. And they're being sold as bee friendly. So just watch out. That seems like a sort of trades descriptions issue at the very least to me. The other one, which you might think, what on earth is he blathering on about now? But most people are completely unaware of this. But many of us have a dog or a cat. Many nature lovers have pets, of course. And if you have, your vet will very likely encourage you to prophylactically treat it against fleas by dripping a product onto its neck once a month. These are the two best-selling brands. They're both really potent insecticides. The one on the left, the active ingredient, you might just be able to see is imidacloprid. That's a neonicotinoid insecticide again. These are banned from use in farming because of clear evidence that they're really poisonous to bees and other wildlife. But you can still buy them and drip them on your dog. Doesn't that seem a bit strange? And the dose that you're supposed to put on your dog every month is enough to kill 60 million honeybees. It's really potent stuff and it's really persistent. It's water soluble. So if your dog goes near water, goes for a swim, then that's a load of insecticide going straight into the river. If you wash the dog's bed, it also goes through the sewage system and out into rivers without really being filtered out, as we recently discovered. It's a paper one of my PhD students published last year. 100% of English rivers contain one or both of those flea treatment pesticides, and most of the time at concentrations which exceed limits that are deemed to be safe by the Environment Agency. So beware if you're a pet owner. Okay, I'm nearly finished. One final quick tip, and I think everyone already knows this, just don't mow so often. This is a really simple thing. If we can persuade people to leave their mower in the shed most of the time, just mow occasionally, but let their lawn grow long and shaggy instead of trying to maintain a Wimbledon tennis court with sort of stripes on it. It's amazing, and that's my lawn, and I didn't do anything to it to encourage flowers. I haven't sown any wildflowers. They just all came up on their own with my slack mowing schedule. And so, leave the mower in the shed instead. Just get a deck chair out and make yourself a gin and tonic and sit and chill. It's a much better way to spend your day. And likewise, councils mow and mow and mow road verges and roundabouts. They're beginning to get the message, some of them. This is a lovely example of what used to be a mown road verge, but now local volunteers have sown with a wildflower mix, and it's teeming with life. We did some research and found that these road verges have way more insect life associated with them than the mown version. Of course, it's pretty obvious. Okay, so to finish up, because I'm out of time, I think we need to basically kind of rewild ourselves if we can. We need to reconnect with nature. We need to stop trying to kill everything and control everything and tidy everything away that we don't like the look of. And somehow rebuild a kind of respect and love for nature, which I think has been lost in recent decades. We don't often stop to think about it, but we live on a rock hurtling through space, which is really odd in itself, but it's got a little crust of life clinging to its surface, mostly different types of insect. But it is everything to us, isn't it? I mean, you know, it's a terrible cliche to say, but there is no planet B. This is it. Surely we should be looking after it better than we have done so far. And I mean, as someone with children, I'm terrified that we would all do anything for our children, wouldn't we? Apart from apparently leave them a decent planet to live on. How stupid is that? We've got to do better. And there's a really easy, simple place to start is by looking after all the insects that live in our gardens. Thank you, everybody, for listening.